Hello and good evening. Welcome to a special DWF Live. We are live now. It's 8 o'clock Eastern Time on Monday night, June 7th. And I'm just going to wait a moment to see some folks tune in. As you're tuning in, let us know where you are watching from. We have viewers from coast to coast to coast that have been joining us for these live sessions. And this is one of our first in the evening. Tonight, we're actually going to be speaking to Dr. Alika Lafontaine, who is a DWF board member, an anesthesiologist, and also the president-elect of the Canadian Medical Association. He's one of the creators of the 215 Pledge, which was launched only a matter of days ago by the Gord Downie and Chanie Wenjack Fund, and it's a growing coalition to call for meaningful change. We are so excited to have the opportunity to talk about this more, as it's been providing a framework to understand the grief process, but also to ensure that there's real action and change that comes to be. I was having a bit of a chat with Dr. Lafontaine a moment ago, and we were talking about the intention of the pledge and what we are hoping, both at the Gord Downie and Chanie Wenjack Fund, but with the entire growing group of people that have been supporting this, what we're desiring that it will achieve. And we hope that you do join us. If you go to 215pledge.ca now, you can sign and become part of this growing coalition to try to really create some lasting change. So let me tell you a little bit first about Dr. Alika Lafontaine. As I mentioned, he is the president-elect of the Canadian Medical Association. He's an award-winning physician, speaker, alignment consultant, and the first Indigenous physician listed by the Medical Post as one of Canada's 50 most powerful doctors. He's a recognized expert on Indigenous health systems and health policy, institutional bias, racism, and reflective practice. For 3 years, he led the Indigenous Health Alliance project, whose mission was to establish health transformation within Indigenous health systems, led politically by Indigenous leadership representing more than 150 First Nations across 3 provinces. In 2018, $68 million of federal funding was committed towards health transformation within these Indigenous territorial regions. He has been doing such incredible work, holding operational roles within Alberta Health Services and also being seen as the Northern representative. And he continues his work in a really meaningful way, both within the individual communities he serves and also nationally as part of the Gord Downie and Chanie Wenjack Fund and the president-elect of the CMA. So I would like to welcome Dr. Alika Lafontaine to tell us about the 215 Pledge. Hello.
Hi, thanks for having me, Audra.
Oh, you're so welcome. So glad that you're here. And I've been really looking forward to this since the pledge was launched, as I'm really curious personally to hear more about how it came to be.
Yeah, so like many things that the Downie Wenjack Fund is involved in, it was really a partnership between many different people. So the idea around the 215 Pledge started as a result of just listening to conversations that were happening, things that communities that were directly impacted by the uncovering of those unmarked graves near the Kamloops Indian Residential School in BC, but also the outpouring of support that happened from non-Indigenous and Indigenous communities across the country. And we were thinking of ways of processing the grief that we're going through, and this led to a discussion around how could we take those stages of grief and actually create an action plan for how people could react to the uncovering of these unmarked graves and the need to explore these sorts of situations at residential schools across the country. And so there was participation from many people within the Downie Wenjack Fund. There was a lot of engagement that we did with champions across the country that were both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And what we really hope is that we have a rallying call to create a coalition to move forward the things that communities need in dealing with this tragedy.
So it's only been around for a few days, and already we have over 4,000 signatures, which is great, and a lot of people that are committing to this. But can you tell us a bit more, when you started to develop it, it wasn't just enough to create a call to action. You actually developed an entire framework around this, and I understand that it's based on the stages of grief.
Mm-hmm. I think when people hear about residential schools, and especially, events like what happened in Kamloops that they really wonder, like, what can I do? I'm overwhelmed by this sense of grief. I want to reach out and engage with people who are going through this trauma directly, but I'm not sure how. I'm not sure what I can do to support them. And so you often get some very, nebulous things that come out, like sending thoughts and prayers and, just generalized support. And what we really wanted to create was this way for people to understand what you have to accept in order to move forward with, an event like this. And then also what you can do more than just thoughts and prayers, you know? And I think that very first step that we talk about, the first stage in grief, which really comes down to denial. We wanted to underline that if you can't accept that this narrative was not an isolated event, that what happened to these children was, a unique story that just happened near this residential school, it's tough to really understand what survivors and their families are going through and to be a part of the conversation. And then from that step, there's a series of other steps that, you can move forward with. We don't want people to not be angry about this. We should be angry as Canadians that this happened. We should be angry that, these children have been in a place for so long that has been unmarked. You know, these children have never been forgotten by their families. They've never been forgotten by their communities, but they haven't had the chance to, really, really have the history of what happened to them uncovered in a way that Canadians can access and can be a part of our broader history. And so we really want people to embrace that anger, because that anger could be channeled and directed towards something good. And then moving on with the other three steps: negotiation, depression, acceptance. We really need to step back and figure out how we can support communities in searching for grave sites like this across the country, because we know that there are stories there. We know that when the TRC was in place, there was a whole section within the report that was actually talking about, all these children that didn't come home and, maybe in these places like unmarked graves or elsewhere. And then finding ways that we can support families in kind of the depth of their trauma, as depression kind of takes hold of communities, having the opportunity to be reunited with children who've been uncovered within these unmarked graves, I think is a really important part of that healing process. And then, moving to the next stage where we can build on, what this moment can create for Canadians, which is helping us to accept and understand, the experiences of everyone who's been involved in this residential school trauma. I think it just gives a bit of a map to help us move from, that original stage where we know that this stuff is going on, we know it affects us, we know it's affecting the people around us, and take us through different steps so we can get to a point where we actually do something about it. And I'm really excited about how quickly the pledge has been adopted. A big part of that is, Chanie Wenjack Fund and the relationships that have been there for, the last few years, and, the Downey family and the Wenjack family, and, the story that they share. But I think it also taps into just a broader Canadian experience that, when we learn things about our history, we want to be able to, reach that point where we can start to get to that healing that can happen.
It's incredible to hear the depth of everything that was that supports the creation of this, that it wasn't just simply thrown together as a pledge, but there's so much meaning behind everything you were describing there. I'll bring up the pledge in a moment. If anyone wants to see it right away, you can go to 215pledge.ca. We have a few survivors that are tuning in as well, and want to say hello to Trina. She's a Northern Saskatchewan survivor of Prince Albert Indian Residential School. And then Selena is also saying a hello to Trina. Yes, and recognizing that there was family that were at that school as well. Isn't it incredible how the connection and social media has really given us the opportunity to connect with each other in a way we never have before? I mean, we weren't doing these videos before the pandemic started. And it's been a time of a lot of grief for communities with COVID. I know that you've been working very hard around that as well. And then also just the isolation. So it's a really interesting thing when people can't gather in the same way we normally would. And it's hopeful that this is creating a sense of connection even still. Have you heard much from families or from those that are experiencing or grieving in this time of how they're finding those points of connection?
No, I think in speaking with people that have been directly affected by what happened at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, and speaking with families who have these stories, who've carried these stories with them for so many years, it's we're still in that part where people are trying to deal with the unlayered trauma that's happened. I think when the TRC had its different um, sessions across the country, it was an unlayering of that trauma that people had carried with them for so long. For the first time, they were able to speak out loud about their truth, and have their truth shared in a forum where they could feel safe. I think we're seeing that happen again. We're going to be going through, I think, another cycle where survivors and their families are going to be able to share these things that happened to them. And the second time that we share, I hope will be better than the last. I remember when the TRC came through with different stories, people were commonly asking, did this really happen? Are you sure that this is, the circumstances that surrounding it? Are you remembering it correctly, etc.? I do think this time around it's different. People are much more willing to accept the lived experience of the trauma that people went through. And I know when we were putting together the idea of the pledge, we really wanted to honor the space that needed to be filled by people who actually went through these experiences. I have family members who went through residential schools. I'm the grandson of residential school survivors. But the experiences of everyone need to fill the space. And there will be schools that I think we will find, other unmarked graves. And it's important to make sure that those communities know that as we move forward to actually implement the specifics behind everything. There may be general principles that we talk about in the pledge, but those specifics need to be filled by the families that, are affected and the people who hold these stories. And we really want to honor that and make sure that that's at the center of, where all of this action kind of moves us forward. So I'm really happy that, persons who have been impacted by residential schools are watching this today. And I'm really proud that they're sharing their stories and actually using their names to say, this was a part of my life. This did impact me. And this is just the truth. Because I think that's going to move us forward to that end goal of reconciliation that we always talk about. But it won't be until we reach an environment where everyone can have confidence that they can share their lived truth and just have it accepted.
Yes. In fact, that was something that we heard a lot of even from Chanie Wenjack's sisters. Daisy, Pearl, and Evelyn all were reflecting on their experiences. I actually have a quote here from Pearl. She says, "We have shared our stories of unmarked graves and many more lost children not documented in official records. Now everyone knows we weren't lying." And Evelyn as well said, "We have always said that there was a lot of children who went missing. There has never been an answer to what has happened to them." And that really does speak to the fact that many people wouldn't even believe. And I think that it's very difficult that as the people living in Canada come to this truth, and many non-Indigenous folks who are starting to understand the weight of this, it's like trying to know what to do and how to hold space for that grief. But also, I mean, for myself, even as I think about this, I go, I understand that that's going to require so much more and so much more support for communities. And I know that the TRC was such a challenging time. So as these stories come forward, what else needs to be done? So, yeah, I really appreciate you sharing as you have.
Yeah, I think there'll be the opportunity, I think, as well for our current generation. Even in the last few years, like my 4 kids have gotten old enough that they're asking questions about this. When the TRC was coming through, and the things that were being shared there, were making their way into the news, they were too young to understand what was going on. And I think that this is a real opportunity for me and my family to reconnect with our own stories, but also the stories of others, and really support kids who are coming through who, are really going to be the leaders that will be moving us forward in the next decade or so, to just have this be a part of who they are and what they recognize as part of the history of Canada. And I think that's a painful process. My heart goes out to all of the families who are revisiting the trauma that, they had just gone through in the course of the TRC and its final report, who are now going through the cycle again. But with pain often comes a great opportunity to teach. That's one of the things that I think elders from cultures across, Indian country, teach us, as you feel things and as things hurt, you have the opportunity to lean into those things and get something out of it. It could be a gift that, the Creator has sent you, an opportunity that the Creator sent to you. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the conversation continue to move forward. I read on Facebook and Twitter and all the other social feeds that I'm on, stories from people, and I want the people who are on watching this right now, like you are seen. I see you, my children see you. There are people that I work with, other doctors from across the country, who reach out to me and say, I saw this story, help me to understand this. How can I help? And it's coming from a place where people are really believing what you're sharing. It's coming from a place of truth and a place of respect. So I think residential school survivors and their families should be really proud. Because of your work, we've gotten to the point where when these stories make their way back into the news, we're having a different conversation than we did when the TRC came through. And I'm really proud of that.
We're very grateful that at DWF, really grateful to have you on the board and all those that made this possible, knowing that it was beyond the Gord Downie and Chanie Wenjack Fund, but just something that we knew was so much bigger. And we're very, very grateful to be able to support it and to have, encouraged everyone that's in our network to be part of it and to sign and to share. Those who are watching today, please go to 215pledge.ca, sign, share, get everyone else on board. Dr. Alika, I'd love to share the website so people can see it. I'm just going to share my screen here. And can you walk us through, there's a few who have just tuned in. I'd love if you'd walk us through one more time the actual pledge based on each of the stages so I can show them on the screen as we go.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the pledge page, it talks a little bit about how everything originated and conversations that happened around the uncovered remains of 250 children buried at the site of the Kamloops Indian Residential School. As we move into the pledge, each one of the words that are in there, we really tried to be thoughtful and reflect what we've heard from Indigenous communities across the country, and also the questions that were being asked by non-Indigenous communities and people across the country. And we really try and frame it as an action plan. There's so many people that have heard about this story, and the fact that it happened to children, and the reality that these children didn't make it home to their families. But not only did they not make it home to their families, there weren't records of what happened to these children. I think for many Canadians, they just wonder, how in the world could that have happened? How could that happen in the Canada that I know and love? And so this is a way for people to process as they kind of go through understanding the shared history that we all have, and that the truth of residential school survivors continues to inform and expand what we understand about where we come from. So, making sure that they're seen as lost children. These are not children who've been forgotten by their communities. And then walking through the 5 stages of grief, which is one way for people to really understand what they're feeling and move towards some sort of action. So the first stage of grief is denial. And I think when we talk about uh, this event and this uncovering of these graves, there's sometimes a pushback that this was a one-off event, that this was unique to the area around the Kamloops and Indian residential school. The truth is these stories exist across the country. Otter talked about a quote from Harriet Wenjack, who spoke about these stories being shared in her area. I know that although I'm from southern Saskatchewan, we have stories from there. I know there's stories from northern Alberta. It's likely that this happened across Canada. And these stories are there. They were inside a section of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report. So I encourage you to look there. But we've known for a long time that these were not isolated events, even though we didn't search out for these unmarked graves. After denial and the next stage of grief, you often get angry. And in speaking about how to deal with that anger, one of the things that we spoke a lot about as we were putting this together is that we should really embrace that we're angry about it. We should be angry that this happened. We should be angry that these children and their deaths weren't documented in a way that their communities knew what happened to them. And so we can use that anger and channel it towards making change. One of the calls from communities across the country is that we really need to have some sort of structured search in Canada. And I think in speaking about this, there's additional depth and detail that come out as you listen and hear what experts within this area are talking about. I think it's really important for us not to just have anyone uncover these grave sites. There are persons who have the skills and expertise in how to do this properly. How we collect this information and uncover these grave sites will really determine what we can do with that information after. How we can move forward after we find these sites and uncover the children who've been lost at these different locations across the country. And so it's really important for us to make sure we get experts involved and have those experts work with communities who have these stories and know where these sites are. The next step in the stages of grief is depression. I think one of the ways that we can really help families work through the trauma of going through this, of knowing that, loved ones were buried in unmarked sites and hadn't been reunited, is by actually reuniting families with the remains of these loved ones. And I imagine that anyone who's been in this space knows that this is one of the calls that's been going out from communities across the country. And then really the fifth step, and I think that this is really where this tragedy can take us, is just increasing the acceptance of the experiences of all those who've been affected by residential schools. I think it's about time for Canada to move past the stages where we question whether or not this is a part of our history, where we question whether or not these graves exist, and just start to accept that this is the lived truth of those who've gone through it. Not just residential school survivors, but their families as well. And taken together, this really provides a framework, especially for non-Indigenous Canadians, to work through what exactly they can do in order to help Indigenous Canadians, particularly those who have experienced the impacts of residential schools within their families and communities. They can support them to kind of move through this event and into the opportunities that lie after. One of the things I've thought a lot about over the last few days is I've had a huge amount of calls from non-Indigenous colleagues from across the country who are really asking, how could this happen? How could this be my Canada? How can I support Indigenous communities? And I've seen so much amazing art and poetry that's come out as people have been processing their grief within our communities across the country. And these children are really giving us the opportunity to engage in this conversation again. They're really tapping into the humanity that lies at the core of strong communities across Canada. and it's really being built around the experience of residential school survivors and their families. And although it is a tragedy and there's so much grief that goes along with it, I think it's going to take us to a better place if we can find a way to channel and work our way through. And that's really what the pledge is about. That's what the pledge is hoping to achieve. And at the end of the day, after the pledge gets adopted and more and more people start to see the places that they can fit into, communities are going to give the specifics on how this action needs to get done. And that to me is the most exciting part of joining the pledge and being a part of this, is you're making a commitment that communities are going to lead the way through this. And I think that that's a big part of healing.
Excellent. Yeah, that's really the only way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We've had a few more tune in. If you are just joining us, remember to go to 215pledge.ca. Dr. Alica, this has been wonderful and has just been so enlightening and helped us to understand a bit more of the framework of the pledge, the intention behind it, and also how it does provide that structure and that framework to help us move forward toward reconciliation, knowing that's never a place that, not a journey point or destination, but rather a path that we're walking collectively. So both as Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples come to understand all the truth of what's being revealed at this time. DWF stands beside those that are in grief, and also we are continuing to work with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities to help raise awareness through the 215 Pledge. So we really appreciate you being part of this today. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us, Dr. Alica, before we go?
Just a closing thought that, I have my stories, and I wish that I could have told my grandfather more before he passed, that I believed his stories, and so in honor of him and his experiences and other family members within my own family, I believe your stories. When you share your pain and your lived experience, I believe you. And I hope more and more Canadians, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and those who live in Canada, are going to express that to you, because you do matter. Your stories matter. Finding these unmarked graves and reuniting these children with their families is really, really important. And it always starts with the truth. And we believe you.
Well, thank you everybody so much for tuning in for this very special DWF Live interview with Dr. Alika Lafontaine. We are grateful to be having this conversation and to be part of moving things forward, we hope, and actually doing something to help create change with the 215 Pledge. So we encourage you to sign up, 215pledge.ca. Please share. If you are just tuning in now, go back to the beginning. This recording will stay live here, and you can share it with people if they want to understand a bit more about the pledge. And hopefully there will be more conversations like this in the future that will help us to continue on that path. So again, Dr. Alica, thank you so very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, have a good night, everybody. Thank you for being part of this.